Germans of Reddit, how was Adolf Hitler taught in your school? In general, you come back to World War II and the Holocaust several times during school. I read Anne Frank's diary in religion class, I think in 7th grade. Hitler's rise to power and the Holocaust usually are taught in the 8th or 9th and again in 12th grade. However, you might analyse some speeches or the political system during other classes than history too. During the early years, you learn how evil Hitler and the Nazis were, how many people died because of them, and what the Holocaust was. Then you might learn what that meant on an individual level for Jews, Anne Frank's diary. As you go further, you learn how the Nazis came to power, why Germans voted for them, and how the propaganda worked. Finally, you start to analyse the conditions that made regular people become mass murderers or fanatical soldiers of the Third Reich. As you can see, you start with a clear black-white image, then learn why they came into power, and finally question yourself if you could have been one of those people, and how to prevent such a thing from ever happening again. Alongside this, you might visit a concentration camp. I myself visited Buchenwald and Hadamar, a euthanasia site in which, for example, disabled people were killed. Alongside this, you might analyse speeches, art or songs of that period in different classes. This was my experience. I went to school in a couple of different South German cities, Munich, Heidelberg and Stuttgart. Starting in 8th grade onwards, we really seemed to focus on the Industrial Revolution and after. The last quarter of the school year was always focused on World War II with some pretty short, "Oh yeah, then we were split into 2 countries and that was bad, reunification happened in the 1990s. The older we got, the more detailed it tended to become. One of my graduation topics in German literature was exile poetry. There were at least 2 excursions to concentration camps built into the curriculum, Dachau in grade 8 or 9, and then Auschwitz-Birkenau during our senior trip. I went on neither trip because I realised pretty quickly I didn't want to be around a bunch of middle schoolers who only knew one Jewish person, me, in a concentration camp. The second one happened during Yom Kippur, which seemed oddly fitting. When I went training for a couple of weeks in Vilseck, I took a Saturday visit to Dachau. The impression that I got is that the Germans took extreme care to preserve the history and provide all the facts regarding the camp. It was very sombre and emotional at some points. I felt like Germans are eternally apologetic regarding the Holocaust. Well, we first got taught about World War I and then went into how Hitler started. As a small boy, how he got into politics, etc. Then World War II and the Holocaust. After that, we went to a Konzentrationslager, concentration camp near Berlin. It was truly heartbreaking walking around there and seeing everything. Seeing the gas chambers, the beds, the clothes, and the numbers they were given instead of their names. We even met someone who survived the concentration camp. I can't even imagine what he went through. That sounds very rough to go through a concentration camp. We never had a chance to do that. But we went to Bunker Valentin next to Bremen, where a factory for submarines was planned. Also the prisoner camp called Sandbostel, where the workers were held under pretty bad circumstances, especially the Russian ones. We heard stories about their food being made out of wood shavings. I am German and went to Dachau on a school trip. It is so massive and insane that it did not really affect me deeply. I know about the horror from school and the many books that deal with the subject from various angles, but the horror itself is so unfathomable, so beyond normal human comprehension, that my brain treats it like something abstract, almost fictional. I guess it's the same reason why watching one person die is horrible, but hearing about thousands of civilians dying is just news. We have him in school now. I'm from Germany. Well, basically he is taught to us in a very neutral way. We learn how he seized power, started the Second World War, etc. But when it comes to the very bad things like killing of millions of Jews, teachers usually say how bad he was. I learned half a year of 9th grade about him and the Nazi regime. Now we have him in the second half of the 11th grade, so we learn a lot about the Nazis, actually because the government doesn't want us to forget this brutal past. Wait, he's there in your class with you? Yeah, I see him in the halls sometimes between 2nd and 3rd Reich. I'm Austrian, but I guess that still counts. Also, please feel free to correct me on any grammatical spelling errors, as English is not my first language. We're covering World War II right now, actually. First, we learned about World War I and its aftermath. Then about how Hitler gained power and how he became Chancellor. Our current topic is the Anschluss. We've watched a video of one of Hitler's speeches, and next year we're going on an excursion to Mauthausen to see the concentration camps there. I've read the diary of Anne Frank, but we're not reading it at school. My teacher does teach the lessons neutrally, I think, but sometimes, like for example when we watched the video of Hitler's speech, or when we were talking about the deportation of Jewish people, she puts emphasis on how horrible this era of history truly was. I guess that if we didn't have an idea of how much people suffered during this time, and how many lives the war cost, history would be much more likely to repeat itself. Your grammar and spelling is better than my English teachers. I live in America. For some reason, English teachers in school always had terrible typing grammar in emails and such. I guess it's just laziness. Our history classes were very chronological all through high school. And by the time we reached World War II, you were clearly old enough to know about Hitler and World War II, so our history classes were really quite neutral and focused on facts and backgrounds. However, the topic of World War II, Hitler, and the committed atrocities by the Nazi regime popped up in other classes basically from the beginning of high school, even primary school. You'd read stories or books about it, watch movie clips, go to exhibitions, etc. When that topic was talked about in those classes, it was more about all the horrors that were inflicted by the Nazi regime, what it meant to the people at that time, both victims and followers, and a very critical reflection and analysis on why this could happen and how to prevent it from happening again. In the end, the subtext of all these classes were a lot about ethics, morals, human behaviour, human faults, human inhumanity, realising your own shortcomings and the responsibility you had to understand what happened, how it happened, and to prevent it from happening. Obviously, the way things were taught and talked about were very different depending on which age you were as a kid. But you have to realise that for Germans, you usually don't learn about the Nazi past in school, but you just know it before. It's on TV a lot, magazine covers, etc. Sometimes you still have older relatives who lived in that time. My grandparents were in their 20s during World War II, so I knew from them. But for me, school sort of brought all the snippets that I knew together and formed a bigger picture and made me understand a lot of things. Do the older people talk about it, like what they did or friends that went missing? It really depends. You can't give a general answer to this. Some are still traumatized or guilty themselves. Those usually don't talk about it. Then again, it was so long ago, by now there aren't many survivors of this era left. The last ones will be gone in a few years. I think this will be a big challenge in the future. We have to keep their legacy and memories alive, and keep telling their stories so no one will ever forget them, or people may start to think, it wasn't all that bad. I'm in my mid-20s. My grandparents were kids when the war ended. The stories they tell are rather about the end of the war and soldiers giving them gum than the war, since their families send the kids to relatives in the countryside to safety. They were just too young to really get what happened. That's why studying this in school and making it an everyday topic, lots of documentaries on TV, is so important nowadays. We've lost many people who can give us first-hand accounts to time at this point, and honestly I think it's contributed to the weirdly blasé attitude I ran into with kids my age when I lived in Germany. I don't think any of their parents or grandparents talked to them about the war, or how they participated or stayed silent. I think Germany does very well in acknowledging its role. At the same time, World War II and the Third Reich being so omnipresent in every aspect of the culture desensitized people to an extent. And I think also breeds a certain level of resentment because the younger generation doesn't think it's fair that this is still held above their heads. Which, sure, it's not fair, but in order not to repeat mistakes, you have to know what went wrong. Check here, and I don't know what more to tell you. Our curriculum is almost identical to that of Germans. We're taught about both World Wars and Hitler in middle school, and then again in high school in more detail. And we don't stop there. After the war, we were forced to be a part of the Soviet Union, and we get taught about that too. It's probably the last thing you learn in history in high school, and it's mostly negative, of course. At what age do you graduate from high school? Here in India, we have junior school up to class 5, 10 years, and then high school up to class 12, 18 years. Well, when we're 6 or 7, we start elementary school for 9 years, and at 15 we go to high school for 4 years. We have maturita exams, basically a graduation, in the last year of high school when we're 18 or 19. Then you usually go to university or start working if you have the experience from high school. I'm not German, in fact, I'm Japanese. I lived and worked in Germany in the 1950s. The country was still in its rebuilding stages, and the evidence of the horrible carnage the country suffered was all over. I became good friends with a few Germans who lived in the same neighborhood I did. They became friendly with me upon learning that I was of Japanese descent, and they sort of looked at me as an ally of theirs. We talked about the war and Hitler, and a couple of my friends were quite open with me, extolling the good that Hitler had done for Germany. After World War I, Germany was in pretty bad shape. They told me about how Hitler came upon the scene and he rebuilt the country and brought pride to the people of their new prosperity. To a man, they denounced the treatment of the Jews, but a few of them repeated some of the old suspicions of the Jewish people that Germans held before and during the war. Upon their asking, I related to them how my relatives in Japan were taken in by the nationalistic rhetoric of the times there, but now regretted their country's turn to its militarism. Like the Germans who told of how the country was brought up from its poverty after World War I to its new prosperity, my relatives related how life improved for them with the new regime that unfortunately led them to World War II and their new misery. Both my German friends and my relatives in Japan were taken in by their leaders and never envisaged the horror of the events that followed. My grandparents are Austrian, and the Holocaust absolutely breaks their hearts, because they really truly believed Hitler was turning things around. The propaganda was very real. Hitler was probably a little turned around. Hitler was turning something around, and it wasn't the economy, it was human rights. German school history in a nutshell, at least mine. Half a year ancient Greeks and Romans, half a year Middle Ages, rest of school career, World War I, Treaty of Versailles, National Socialist Germany. It was the dominant topic in school. Hitler was treated the way he was, everything on the table. We even went on a multi-day trip to visit a concentration camp, Dachau. Wait a minute, you didn't learn about the French Revolution a gazillion times? So much French Revolution. 90% of my history classes were Nazi stuff, followed by French Revolution, followed by Nazi stuff, followed by French Revolution, etc., etc. I wouldn't call it learning about. I think it got mentioned in the rush from the Middle Ages to World War I that took about 3 school hours. I'm from Austria, and I was told how he became powerful and what he did in order to get there, etc. Well, most of the things you need to know about the topic. But as I visited Hartheim, I got told a bit more. Hartheim was the location of a concentration camp for disabled people, and my mother knew someone from there. And he told us a lot of things they don't tell you in school. The Nazis made a lot of scientific discoveries as they tried to create the Aryan race. Basically, they wanted tall, handsome people with white skin and blue eyes, and they did a lot in order to get there. One of those things I got told was that they knew about the fact that if a woman is pregnant with twins and the blood of one baby gets into the eye of the other while they are in the womb, it could cause a change of eye color from brown to blue. So they made tests on living twin children where they took blood from one and ingested it into the eye of the other with a syringe. Another thing I heard was that especially in Hartheim, where they had a lot of disabled people, they did not see them as living things, so they made practical use of their bodies after these experiments. So they made bags and lampshades out of skin. Today there is a hospital, especially for disabled people in Hartheim, and one of the patients is an artist my mum knew from her childhood. He is painting pictures with his feet and mouth because he can't move his arms. Those are some pretty weird paintings. I try to find them. As a mildly disabled American, this is one of my biggest fears about what's going on right now. Well, the world is an S-hole, and there will always be dumb, ignorant S-heads out there. But I got the feeling it's about to get better as the younger generations get more and more open-minded about a lot of things. A lot of those ignorant, discriminatory people I see in my country are older generations. And I know it sounds hard to say this, but they are going to die eventually. I think everything you can do is make the best out of your situation, as this artist did I was talking about. He had no arms, which caused him to use his feet and mouth. In other words, don't focus on the things you don't have, just focus on the things you have and train them to the point where they get useful for something.